The security cameras captured everything. Two apex predators, a lion and a leopard, working together to unlock their enclosure at midnight, then systematically opening every cage in the Sacramento Zoo before vanishing into the California wilderness. What the footage didn't show was the woman who had trained them to trust each other, or why after 8 years of separation, they had finally chosen this moment to execute the escape plan she had unknowingly taught them during the darkest period of her life. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the empty lion enclosure at dawn, her weathered hands gripping the bent metal bars as news crews gathered outside the zoo's perimeter. At 52, her black hair was streaked with premature silver, and the scar running from her left temple to her jawline caught the morning light. A permanent reminder of the IED explosion in Afghanistan that had ended her military career and led her to this moment. The zoo director's voice crackled through her radio, demanding answers she wasn't sure she could give, at least not the complete truth. The escape had been executed with military precision. Atlas, the 400-pound African lion, had somehow manipulated the electronic lock on his enclosure, a feat that should have been impossible for an animal lacking opposable thumbs. The surveillance footage showed him working methodically, using his massive paws with surprising dexterity, while Nala, the sleek female leopard from the adjacent habitat, kept watch. Once free, they had moved through the zoo like a coordinated tactical unit, opening enclosures for the tigers, bears, and wolves before disappearing through a section of fence that had been quietly weakened over several nights. Sarah's radio buzzed again. "Dr. Chen, the police want to speak with you about the animal's behavioral patterns," came the voice of Janet Morrison, the zoo's public relations director. Sarah could hear the barely controlled panic in Janet's tone. 23 animals were now loose in the Sacramento area, though most had been recaptured within hours. But Atlas and Nala remained missing, and with each passing hour, the public's fear grew alongside the media frenzy. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she was being called upon to help recapture the same animals whose trust she had spent 3 years earning, only to lose them when her own demons became too heavy to bear. She closed her eyes and remembered the first time she had seen Atlas, newly arrived from a failed breeding program in Texas, pacing his enclosure with the same restless energy she recognized from her fellow veterans struggling with invisible wounds. That had been 5 years ago, when Sarah was still trying to convince herself that civilian life could provide the sense of purpose she had lost along with her left leg below the knee. The prosthetic she wore was a marvel of modern engineering, but it couldn't replace the confidence she had once carried as Captain Sarah Chen, explosive ordnance disposal specialist, the woman who had defused bombs in Kandahar and Helmand with steady hands and nerves of steel. The zoo had hired her as their new head of animal behavior, impressed by her military background and her recently completed doctorate in zoology, a degree she had earned during the long rehabilitation process at Walter Reed Medical Center. What they didn't know was that she had taken the job because she could no longer trust herself around people, but something about working with dangerous animals felt familiar, even comforting. Atlas had arrived traumatized and aggressive, having spent his first 5 years in inadequate facilities with handlers who feared rather than understood him. He had attacked 2 previous caretakers and was scheduled for euthanasia when Sarah intervened. She saw something in his golden eyes that reminded her of her own reflection during those first months after the explosion. A proud creature reduced to rage by circumstances beyond his control. Sarah had convinced the zoo board to give her 6 months to rehabilitate Atlas, though she kept to herself the fact that she was conducting an unauthorized experiment. During her military service, she had read every available study on animal-assisted therapy, and she suspected that the healing might work both ways. She began spending entire days in Atlas's habitat, initially separated by reinforced barriers, speaking to him in both English and Mandarin, her grandmother's language that she had learned as a child in San Francisco's Chinatown. Emphorius Amhavise. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday in November. Sarah had been telling Atlas about her recurring nightmares, how the smell of diesel fuel still sent her into panic attacks, when she noticed he had stopped pacing and was lying near the barrier, listening. For the first time since his arrival, Atlas's breathing had slowed to a calm rhythm. That day, Sarah realized they were both prisoners of their past traumas, and perhaps they could find freedom together. Nala had arrived 6 months later, a rescue from an illegal exotic pet operation in Nevada. Unlike Atlas's obvious aggression, Nala displayed the withdrawn, hypervigilant behavior Sarah recognized from her own struggles with post-traumatic stress. The leopard would hide in the furthest corner of her enclosure, emerging only to eat, her spotted coat dull from stress and malnutrition. Sarah made a decision that would have horrified zoo safety protocols. She began conducting joint sessions with both cats, gradually introducing them to each other through her presence as a calming influence. She would sit between their adjacent enclosures, reading aloud from books about animal behavior, military history, and sometimes poetry her grandmother had shared with her decades earlier. The connection between Atlas and Nala developed slowly, mediated by Sarah's consistent presence and her growing understanding of their individual needs. Atlas's protective instincts, damaged by years of inadequate care, began to focus on Nala's vulnerability. Nala, in turn, seemed to find courage in Atlas's strength. Sarah documented their progress in detailed reports, noting how their stress behaviors diminished when they could see each other, how their sleep patterns synchronized, and how they had developed a complex system of vocalizations that seemed almost like conversation. During this period, Sarah's own healing accelerated. The nightmares became less frequent, her chronic pain manageable, and for the first time since her injury, she began to believe she might build a meaningful life outside the military. She started dating again, rekindled friendships with fellow veterans, and even began mentoring other disabled soldiers who visited the zoo through various therapy programs. But Sarah's recovery was built on a foundation she didn't recognize as fragile until it began to crumble during her 4th year at the zoo. The first sign of trouble came during budget discussions in March, when the zoo board announced they would be eliminating the animal behavior research program due to funding cuts. Sarah sat in the sterile conference room, listening to board members discuss Atlas and Nala as line items in a spreadsheet, their voices clinical and detached as they debated which animals would be relocated to other facilities. The familiar tightness in her chest returned, the same suffocating sensation she had experienced in military briefings where human lives were reduced to casualty estimates. Sarah's protests fell on deaf ears. The board had already contacted facilities in Arizona and Montana, places where Atlas and Nala would be separated, housed in standard enclosures without the specialized care they had grown accustomed to. When Sarah mentioned the behavioral progress both animals had made, Board Chairman Robert Hayes dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "They're animals, Dr. Chen. They'll adapt." That night, Sarah found herself standing in the zoo after hours, a violation that could cost her job. But she needed to see Atlas and Nala, to somehow explain what was coming. Atlas approached the fence when he heard her footsteps, his massive head tilting in the way that had become familiar over their years together. Nala emerged from her favorite perch on the artificial rock formation, her yellow eyes reflecting the security lights as she descended to ground level. Sarah began to speak in the soft, rhythmic tone she had developed during their sessions. She told them about the impending separation, about the new facilities they would call home, about how this chapter of their lives was ending. She wasn't sure if they understood her words, but their body language suggested they sensed the gravity of her distress. Atlas pressed against the fence, a low rumble emanating from his chest. Not aggressive, but mournful. Nala moved to the section of fence closest to Atlas's enclosure, the two cats positioning themselves as near to each other as their separate habitats allowed. The guilt of what she had done began to consume Sarah. By creating this bond between the animals, by using them as part of her own healing process, she had set them up for a trauma she couldn't protect them from. The parallel to her military experience was impossible to ignore. Once again, she had grown attached to something that would inevitably be taken away by forces beyond her control. Hunt rolls. Sarah's sleep became fragmented, filled with dreams where she was back in Afghanistan, defusing bombs while Atlas and Nala watched from the shadows. She started avoiding the big cat section during her regular rounds, unable to face the question she saw in their eyes. Her work performance declined as she struggled to focus on routine tasks, and her supervisor began scheduling more frequent check-ins. 2 weeks before the scheduled transfer, Sarah received a call that shattered what remained of her stability. Marcus Rodriguez, her former squad mate and closest friend from her deployment, had been found dead in his Denver apartment. The preliminary investigation suggested suicide, though the family was disputing the findings. Sarah had spoken to Marcus just 3 weeks earlier, and he had seemed optimistic about his new job as a VA counselor, his recent engagement, his plans to visit Sacramento in the summer. Sarah requested emergency leave and flew to Denver for the funeral, where she sat in a crowded church listening to people who barely knew Marcus describe him as a hero who had given his life for his country. She wanted to stand up and scream that Marcus had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, only to be killed by the invisible wounds no one wanted to acknowledge, the same wounds she carried, the same demons that Atlas and Nala had helped her confront. When she returned to Sacramento, Sarah found the zoo transformed. The board had accelerated the timeline for the animal transfers, citing insurance concerns. Atlas and Nala were scheduled to be moved in 3 days. The Arizona facility had sent a transport team to assess the animals and plan the logistics of their relocation. Sarah watched from her office window as strangers with clipboards and tranquilizer guns discussed her friends-like cargo. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. Instead of going home to her apartment, she drove to a bar frequented by other veterans, a dimly lit place where the bartender understood that some customers needed to drink in silence. She had been sober for 18 months, a personal achievement that had coincided with her work with Atlas and Nala, but Marcus's death had reopened wounds she thought had healed. The next morning, Sarah woke up in her car in the zoo parking lot, her head pounding and her hands shaking as she tried to remember how she had gotten there. Her phone showed 7 missed calls from her supervisor and a text message informing her that she was being placed on administrative leave pending a fitness for duty evaluation. The irony was devastating. At the moment when Atlas and Nala needed her most, she had proven herself unreliable. She sat in her car, watching the transport team load equipment while zoo staff avoided making eye contact with her. The animals would be separated tomorrow, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Sarah drove home and spent the day on her couch, staring at photographs from her time working with Atlas and Nala. In one image, she was sitting between their enclosures during an early training session, both cats lying peacefully just a few feet away. In another, Atlas was playing with an enrichment toy she had designed, while Nala watched from her favorite perch. They looked content, healthy, and most importantly, they looked like they belonged together. As darkness fell, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the zoo's chief veterinarian, and one of the few colleagues who had supported Sarah's unconventional methods. Jennifer's voice was tense as she explained that both Atlas and Nala had been exhibiting severe stress behaviors since Sarah's absence, pacing, refusing food, and showing signs of the same agitation they had displayed during their early days at the zoo. The transport was scheduled for dawn, and Jennifer was calling to ask if Sarah would consider coming in to help sedate the animals for the journey. The request felt like a betrayal of everything Sarah had worked to build with them, but she also knew that her presence might be the only thing that could make their transition less traumatic. Sarah arrived at the zoo before sunrise, her hands trembling as she badged through the employee entrance for what she knew would be the last time. The transport trucks were already positioned outside the big cat enclosures, their diesel engines idling in the pre-dawn darkness. The sound triggered an immediate flashback to convoy operations in Afghanistan, and Sarah had to steady herself against the fence post as her breathing became shallow and rapid. Dr. Walsh approached with 2 loaded tranquilizer guns, her expression grim. "They haven't eaten in 3 days," she said quietly. "Atlas keeps pacing the perimeter, and Nala won't come down from her platform. The transport team wants to dart them from a distance, but I thought—" She trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. They both knew that Sarah's presence might be the difference between a traumatic capture and a peaceful transition. Sarah walked slowly toward the enclosures, and both cats immediately responded to her approach. Atlas ceased his agitated pacing and moved to the fence, his golden eyes fixed on her face, with an intensity that made her chest tighten. Nala descended from her elevated perch with fluid grace, positioning herself at the point where her enclosure was closest to both Sarah and Atlas. For a moment, the 3 of them formed their familiar triangle, separated by barriers but connected by something deeper than physical proximity. The transport supervisor, a weathered man named Frank Morrison who had been moving dangerous animals for 20 years, watched this interaction with professional interest. "I've never seen cats respond to a handler like that," he told Dr. Walsh. "Usually they can sense what's coming, and they hide or get aggressive. These two are actually trying to get closer to her." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sarah began speaking to them in the low, measured tones she had used during their therapy sessions, alternating between English and Mandarin as she explained what was about to happen. She told them about their new homes, about how they would each have larger territories and professional care. What she couldn't bring herself to say was that they would never see each other again, that the bond they had formed under her guidance was about to be permanently severed. As Sarah spoke, Atlas moved to the section of fence directly adjacent to Nala's enclosure, pressing his massive frame against the barriers that separated them. Nala mirrored his position, and for several minutes, the two cats maintained this contact while Sarah continued her explanation. The transport team exchanged glances, recognizing behavior they had never witnessed during their years of animal relocations. The sedation process required careful timing and dosage calculations based on each animal's weight and stress level. Sarah had volunteered to enter Atlas's enclosure with the veterinary team, knowing that her presence would likely keep him calm enough for a controlled injection rather than the trauma of being darted from a distance. Atlas had never shown aggression towards Sarah, but protocols demanded that she wear protective gear and maintain safe distances. When Sarah entered the enclosure, Atlas immediately approached but remained several feet away, as if sensing that this interaction was different from their usual sessions. Dr. Walsh moved behind Sarah with the tranquilizer gun, while two backup handlers positioned themselves near the entrance. Sarah knelt down and extended her hand toward Atlas, speaking in the soothing rhythm that had become their shared language over the years. Atlas stepped forward and touched his massive nose to Sarah's palm, a gesture of trust that brought tears to her eyes. In that moment, Dr. Walsh administered the sedative, and Atlas looked up at Sarah with what seemed like understanding before the medication began to take effect. As his legs became unsteady, Sarah remained beside him, stroking his mane and whispering reassurances until he settled into unconsciousness. The process with Nala proved more challenging. Leopards were naturally more suspicious and agile than lions, and Nala had positioned herself on her highest platform where darting would be necessary. Sarah entered the enclosure and began calling to her in Mandarin, using phrases her grandmother had taught her about courage and survival. Slowly, Nala descended, but instead of approaching Sarah directly, she moved to the fence section closest to where Atlas lay sedated in the adjacent enclosure. Sarah realized that Nala was trying to reach Atlas, to understand why he was no longer responding to their usual communication patterns. The leopard began making soft vocalizations, calls that Sarah had never heard before, urgent, questioning sounds that seemed to be directed at her unconscious companion. When Atlas failed to respond, Nala turned to Sarah with an expression that seemed almost accusatory, as if demanding an explanation for this betrayal. The darting of Nala required 3 attempts, as she evaded the first 2 shots with feline agility despite her apparent distress. When the sedative finally took effect, she collapsed near the fence line, her body oriented toward Atlas even in unconsciousness. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Even while chemically sedated, these animals were trying to maintain their connection. Loading the unconscious cats into their respective transport containers was accomplished with mechanical efficiency, but Sarah found herself unable to watch as the heavy doors closed on Atlas and Nala. The sound of metal latches clicking into place seemed to echo with finality, marking the end of a chapter that had defined her healing process and given her life meaning for 3 years. As the trucks pulled away in different directions, Atlas heading toward Arizona, Nala bound for Montana, Sarah stood in the empty enclosures, surrounded by the enrichment toys and climbing structures that would soon be dismantled. The morning sun was fully risen now, and zoo visitors would begin arriving soon to find these habitats vacant, with no explanation of the bonds that had been formed and broken in this place. Dr. Walsh found Sarah sitting on the bench where she used to conduct her sessions, staring at the 2 empty spaces that had once housed her most important patients. "The board wants to meet with you next week," Jennifer said gently. "There's talk of a transfer to the reptile department, maybe a chance to rebuild your career here." Sarah shook her head without looking up. "I can't stay," she said simply. "Every time I walk past here, I'll remember what I took from them, what I let happen." That afternoon, Sarah submitted her resignation letter and began the process of clearing out her office. Among her possessions, she kept only 2 items: a photograph of herself sitting between Atlas and Nala during one of their early sessions, and a small audio recorder containing hours of their vocalizations that she had documented for research purposes. Late that night, she listened to these recordings in her empty apartment, hearing the complex communication patterns that Atlas and Nala had developed, the sounds of a friendship that would never be renewed. Sarah spent the next 8 years drifting between temporary positions at wildlife sanctuaries across the western United States, never staying long enough to form meaningful connections with either animals or colleagues. The guilt of what she had allowed to happen to Atlas and Nala followed her like a shadow, manifesting in sleepless nights and a carefully maintained emotional distance from every creature she encountered. She became known in professional circles as a competent but aloof animal behaviorist who could rehabilitate difficult cases, but never seemed personally invested in the outcomes. Her personal life remained equally isolated. Sarah's apartment in Portland, where she had been working at a wolf sanctuary for the past 2 years, contained only the essentials: a few pieces of functional furniture, boxes of veterinary supplies, and that single photograph of herself with Atlas and Nala tucked away in a drawer she rarely opened. The audio recordings of their vocalizations remained on her laptop, a digital memorial she both treasured and couldn't bear to replay. The call came on a Tuesday morning in September, just as Sarah was preparing to leave for another day of routine animal care. The number displayed on her phone was unfamiliar, but the area code was Sacramento. Her hands shook as she answered, unprepared for the voice of Frank Morrison, the transport supervisor who had overseen Atlas and Nala's separation 8 years earlier. "Dr. Chen, I hope you remember me," Frank said, his typically gruff voice carrying an unusual note of excitement. "I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible, but I've got security footage to prove it." Frank explained that he had recently taken a job as head of security at a private wildlife preserve in Northern California, a facility that housed rescued exotic animals in naturalistic habitats spanning thousands of acres. 3 days earlier, their motion-activated cameras had captured something unprecedented near the preserve's eastern boundary. "2 cats approached our fence line together," Frank continued, "a male lion and a female leopard, traveling as a pair. I've been in this business for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like it. They're not hunting together. They're communicating, coordinating their movements, almost like they're friends," Sarah finished quietly, her heart beginning to race. Frank sent her the footage within the hour, and Sarah watched in stunned silence as the grainy security video showed 2 familiar silhouettes moving through the moonlit forest. Even after 8 years, and despite the poor video quality, she recognized Atlas's distinctive gait and the elegant way Nala positioned herself at his shoulder. They moved with the easy synchronization of longtime companions, pausing occasionally to touch noses before continuing their patrol along the preserve's perimeter. The impossible had somehow become reality. Atlas and Nala had not only survived their years of separation, but had somehow found each other again across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Frank's research into their escape routes revealed a trail of reported sightings spanning 3 states, a lion and leopard traveling together, avoiding human contact, but leaving evidence of their passage in the form of coordinated hunting patterns and shared resting sites. Sarah drove through the night to reach the preserve, her mind racing with questions that had no logical answers. How had they escaped their respective facilities? How had they navigated the complex terrain of the American West to find each other? Most importantly, what did their reunion mean for the guilt she had carried for 8 years? Frank met her at the preserve's entrance as dawn broke over the rolling hills of Northern California. The facility was unlike any zoo Sarah had ever seen. Vast enclosures that resembled natural habitats more than traditional animal exhibits, with minimal barriers and maximum space for the residents to express their natural behaviors. "They've been testing our fence line for 3 nights, Frank explained as he led Sarah to the observation blind overlooking the area where Atlas and Nala had been spotted. Not trying to break in aggressively, but systematically checking for weaknesses. It's like they're planning something." Sarah settled into the blind with a pair of high-powered binoculars and began her vigil. Hours passed without any sign of the cats, and she began to wonder if their presence had been a one-time occurrence. Then, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the preserve, she heard a sound that stopped her breath, a low, rumbling vocalization that she recognized from the recordings on her laptop. Atlas emerged from the tree line first, his mane now fuller and darker than she remembered, his body carrying the lean muscle mass of an animal that had survived years in the wild. He paused at the fence line and repeated the vocalization, a call Sarah realized was directed not at Nala, but at something beyond the preserve's boundaries. Moments later, Nala appeared, her coat gleaming with health and her movements displaying the confident grace of a predator in her prime. But what happened next defied everything Sarah thought she knew about animal behavior. Both cats positioned themselves at the fence line and began a complex series of vocalizations. Not random sounds, but the structured communication patterns Sarah had documented years earlier during their therapy sessions. They were calling to her, using the vocal signatures she had taught them during their time together at the Sacramento Zoo. Sarah left the observation blind and approached the fence, her heart pounding as she began to respond in the language they had developed together. Atlas and Nala immediately moved closer, pressing against the barrier with the same trust they had shown 8 years earlier. Atlas touched his nose to the fence where Sarah's hand rested on the other side, while Nala began the purring vocalizations Sarah remembered from their most peaceful sessions. Frank later told reporters that what he witnessed that day changed his understanding of animal consciousness and memory. Sarah spent 6 hours at the fence line, communicating with Atlas and Nala in their shared language, learning through their responses that they had maintained not only their bond with each other, but their connection to her across time and distance. The preserve's board of directors made an unprecedented decision. They offered Atlas and Nala permanent sanctuary, with Sarah serving as their primary caretaker. The facility's vast enclosures would provide them with territory and freedom, while ensuring their safety and care. Today, Sarah works at the preserve, documenting the continued relationship between Atlas and Nala, while developing new approaches to animal-assisted therapy for veterans struggling with PTSD. Her research has revolutionized understanding of emotional bonds between species and the healing power of interspecies connection. Visitors to the preserve often ask Sarah how it's possible that two apex predators could maintain such a deep friendship, or how they managed to find each other across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Her answer is always the same. Love finds a way, even when logic says it's impossible. The bonds we forge with others, whether human or animal, create invisible threads that distance and time cannot break. Sometimes the greatest healing comes not from moving forward, but from rediscovering connections we thought were lost forever. If this story of impossible friendship and second chances moved you, we'd love to hear about your own experiences with the healing power of animals. Have you ever formed an unexpected bond with a creature that changed your life? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible tales of connection, courage, and the miracles that happen when we open our hearts to the impossible. Uncurl.